Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Statement, the Secretary of State for Health, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about mental health and NHS performance. This government is committed to a shared society in which public services work to the highest standards for everyone. This includes plans announced by the Prime Minister this morning on mental health. I am proud that under this government, 1,400 more people are accessing mental health services every day compared to 2010. And we are investing more in mental health than ever before, with plans for 1 million more people with mental health conditions to access services by 2020. But we recognise there is more to do, and so we will proceed with plans to further improve mental health provision, including formally accepting the recommendations of the Independent Task Force on Mental Health, which will see mental health spend increase by £1 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. A green paper on children and young people's mental health to be published before the end of the year, enabling every secondary school to train someone in mental health first aid, a new partnership with employers to support mental health in the workplace, up to £15 million extra invested in places of safety for those in crisis following the highly successful start to this programme in the last Parliament. An ambitious expansion of digital mental health provision and an updated and more comprehensive suicide prevention strategy. Further details of these plans are contained in the written ministerial statement laid in the House this morning. However, turning to winter, as our most precious public service, the NHS has been under sustained pressure for a number of years. In just 6 years, the number of people over 80 has risen by 340,000, and life expectancy has risen by 12 months. As a result, demand is unprecedented. The Tuesday after Christmas was the busiest day in the history of the NHS, and some hospitals are reporting that A&E attendances are up to 30% higher compared to last year. I therefore want to set out how we intend to protect the service through an extremely challenging period and sustain it for the future. First, Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to staff on the front line. 1.3 million NHS staff, alongside another 1.4 million in the social care system, do an incredible job, which is frankly humbling for all of us in this House. An estimated 150,000 medical staff and many more non-medical staff worked on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. They have never worked harder to keep patients safe, and the whole country is in their debt. With respect to this winter, the NHS has made more extensive preparations than ever before. We started the run-up to the winter period with over 1,600 more doctors and 3,000 more nurses than just a year ago, bringing the total increase since 2010 to 11,400 more doctors and 11,200 more hospital nurses. The NHS allocated £400 million to local health systems for winter preparedness. It nationally assured the winter plans of every trust. It launched the largest ever flu vaccination programme with over 13 million people already vaccinated. It also bolstered support outside A&Es with 12,000 additional GP sessions offered over the festive period. The result has been that this winter has already seen days when A&Es have treated a record number of people within 4 hours, and there have been fewer serious incidents declared than many expected. As Chris Hobson, head of NHS providers, said, although there have been serious problems at some trusts, the system as a whole is doing slightly better than last year. However, there are indeed a number of trusts when the situation has been extremely fragile. All of last week's A&E diverts happened at 19 trusts, of which 4 are in special measures. The most recent statistics show that nearly 3/4 of trolley weights occurred in just 2 trusts. In Worcestershire in particular, there have been a number of unacceptably long trolley waits, and in the media 2 reported deaths while patients were in A&E. We're also aware of ongoing problems in North Midlands with extremely high numbers of 12-hour trolley waits. Nationally, the NHS has taken urgent action to support these trusts, including working intensively with leadership and brokering conversations with social care partners to generate a joined-up approach across systems of concern. As of this weekend, there are some signs that pressure is easing, both in the most distressed trusts and across the system. However, with further cold weather on the way this weekend, a spike in respiratory infections and a rise in flu, there will be further challenges ahead. So NHS England and NHS Improvement will also consider a series of further measures which may be taken in particularly distressed systems on a temporary basis at the discretion of local clinical leaders. These may include temporarily releasing time for GPs to support urgent care work, clinically triaging non-urgent calls to the ambulance service for residents of nursing and residential homes before they're taken to hospital, continuing to suspend elective care, including where appropriate suspension of non-urgent outpatient appointments, working with the CQC on rapid re-inspection when this has the potential to reopen community health and social care bed capacity, working with community trusts and community nursing teams to speed up discharge. Taken together, these actions will give the NHS the flexibility to take further measures as and when appropriate at a local level. However, looking to the future, it is clear we need to have an honest discussion with the public about the purpose of A&E departments. There is nowhere outside the UK that commits to all patients that we will sort out any health need within 4 hours. Only 4 other countries, New Zealand, Sweden, Australia and Canada, have similar national standards, which are generally less stringent than ours. This government is committed to maintaining and delivering that vital 4-hour commitment to patients. But since it was announced in 2000, there are nearly 9 million more visits to our A&Es, up to 30% of whom NHS England estimate do not need to be there, and the tide is continuing to rise. So if we are going to protect our 4-hour standard, we need to be clear it is a promise to sort out all urgent health problems within 4 hours, but not all health problems, however minor. As Professor Keith Willett, NHS England's Medical Director for Acute Care, has said, no country in the world has a standard for all health problems, however small, and if we are to protect services for the most vulnerable, nor can we. So NHS England and NHS Improvement will continue to explore ways to ensure that at least some of the patients who do not need to be in our A&Es can be given good alternative options, building on progress underway with the streaming policy in the NHS England A&E plan. This way we will be able to improve the patient experience for those with more minor conditions who are currently not seen within 4 hours, as well as protect the 4-hour promise for those who actually need it. Mr. Speaker, taken together, what I have announced today are plans to support the NHS in a difficult period, but also plans for a government that is ambitious for our NHS, quite simply to offer the safest, highest quality care available anywhere for both mental and physical health. But they will take time to come to fruition, and in the meantime, all our thoughts are with NHS and social care staff who are working extremely hard over the winter and throughout the year, both inside and outside our hospitals, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jonathan Ashworth.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for an advance copy of his statement. And Mr. Speaker, I too begin by paying tribute to all the NHS staff that are working day in, day out to provide the highest possible care to patients at this busy period. Now, of course, we do welcome measures to improve mental health services in this country, as indeed we welcomed such announcements exactly 12 months ago when the then Prime Minister made similar promises. But does the Secretary of State not agree that if this Prime Minister wants to shine a light on mental health provision, she should aim her torch at the government's record? 6,600 fewer nurses working in mental health, a reduction in mental health beds, 400 fewer doctors working in mental health, and perhaps most disgracefully of all, the raiding of children's local mental health budgets in order to plug funding gaps in the wider NHS. Could he therefore tell us why the Prime Minister this morning was unable, therefore, to confirm that money for mental health would be ring-fenced to have stopped this raiding of budgets happening in the future? And now we will welcome support on measures to improve mental health support in schools. Will the government offer more resources to local authority education psychologists? And what provision will be in place to give teachers suitable training for doing this work? Now, turning to the winter crisis. This morning, the Secretary of State said that things have only been, and I quote, falling over in a couple of places. So let's look at the facts. A third of hospitals declared last month they needed urgent help to deal with the number of patients coming through the doors. A&E departments have turned away patients more than 140 times. 15 hospitals ran out of beds in one day in December. Several hospitals have warned they can't offer comprehensive care. Elderly patients have been left languishing on hospital trolleys in corridors, sometimes for over 24 hours. And he says care is only falling over in a couple of places. I know La La Land did well at the Golden Globes last night. I didn't realise the Secretary of State was living there. Perhaps that's where he's been all weekend. So can he now confirm that the NHS is facing a winter crisis and the blame for this lies at the doors of number 10 Downing Street? Does the Secretary of State agree it was a monumental error to ignore the pleas for extra support for social care in the autumn statement a few weeks ago? Will he now support calls to bring forward the extra £700 million allocated for 2019? Will he bring that forward now to help social care? And will he urge the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to announce a new funding settlement for the NHS and social care at this March's budget so this year's crisis never happens again? And with respect to the 4-hour A&E target he has just announced, can I just press him further? Is he now really telling patients that rather than trying to hit that 4-hour target, the government is now in fact rewriting and downgrading it? If so, does NHS England support this move? And what guidance has he taken from the Royal College of Emergency Medicines that this is an appropriate change to the waiting time standard? Now, Mr. Speaker, this Secretary of State has made patient safety an absolute priority. In that, he has our unswerving support. Will he agree, I am sure, that one of the most upsetting reports to come out of hospitals last week was the death of 2 patients at Worcestershire Royal who had been waiting on hospital trolleys? Can I ask the Secretary of State if he will commit to personally lead an inquiry into these deaths? Is he aware whether these were isolated incidences? And when does the Trust intend to report back on its own investigation? And will he undertake to keep the House updated on these matters? In conclusion, there is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that this current crisis could have been averted. Hospital bosses, council leaders, patient groups, MPs from across the House urged the Chancellor to give the NHS and social care extra money in the autumn statement. Those requests fell on deaf ears, and we are now seeing the dismal consequences. NHS staff deserve better. Patients deserve better. The government needs to do better. Can I urge the Health Secretary, get a grip?
I'm happy to respond to the honourable gentleman's comments and indeed to the comments of all honourable members. But I just say this about the tone of what he said. He speaks as if the NHS never had any problems over winters when Labour was in power. And let me just say to him very simply, the one thing NHS staff do not want right now is for any party to start weaponising the NHS for party political purposes. And let me remind him that where his party runs the NHS, double the number of people are on waiting lists for NHS treatments. A&E performance is 10% lower. People wait twice as long to have their hips replaced. Whatever the problems are in the NHS, Labour is not the solution. Now, he talked about mental health. So let me tell him what's happening on mental health. Thanks to the efforts of this government and the Conservative-led coalition, we now have some of the highest dementia diagnosis rates in the world. Our Talking Therapies programme, which is one of the most popular programmes for the treatment of depression and anxiety, is treating 750,000 more people every year and is being copied by people in Sweden. We are treating every day 1,400 more people for mental health conditions. We have record numbers of psychiatrists. He mentioned mental health nurses. In this Parliament, we're training 8,000 more. That's a 22% increase. And all of this is backed up by what we are confirming today, which hasn't been done before, that the government is accepting the report of the independent task force review led by Paul Farmer, the chief executive of Mind, which commits us to spending £1 billion more a year in mental health by the end of this Parliament. I just say to him that would not be possible with the spending commitments that Labour was prepared to make for the NHS in the last Parliament, and it's because of this government's funding that we are able to make these commitments on mental health. Now, he talked about the NHS, and he gave completely the wrong impression of what I said this morning. I was completely clear that all NHS hospitals are operating under greater pressure than they have ever operated under. But he should perhaps listen to independent voices like Chris Hobson, no friend of the government when it comes to NHS policy, who is very clear that in the vast majority of trusts, people are coping actually slightly better than last year, but we have some very serious problems in a few trusts, including Worcestershire and a number of others. And I can commit to him that we will follow closely the reports, the investigations into the 2 reported deaths at Worcestershire, and keep the House updated. But, you know, and this is where I think his politicising goes wrong. He talked about social care. Social care last year, spending went up by around £600 million. He stood on a platform at the last election of not a penny more to local authorities for social care. Not a penny more. To stand here as a defender of social care is frankly an insult to vulnerable people up and down the country, but particularly people living under Labour councils like Hounslow, Merton and Ealing, where they are refusing to raise the social care precept but complaining about social care funding. But he also talked more generally about NHS funding, and I just say this: in the last Parliament it wasn't the Conservatives who cut funding for the NHS, it was his party who cut funding for the NHS. It wasn't the Conservatives who said funding the 5-year forward view was impossible. It was his party. They said the cheque would bounce. Well, it hasn't bounced, and we're putting that money in. Tough as it is, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, on the NHS front line, I do say that he was right to raise this issue in this House, but wrong to raise it in the way he did. Under this government, the NHS has record doctors, record nurses, record funding. Care, despite the pressures of winter, is safer, higher quality and reaching more people than ever before, and it's time to support those on the front line, not try to use them for party political points.
Dr Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and also the Prime Minister's focus today in her speech on mental health. She spoke of holding the NHS leadership to account for the extra billion that we'll be investing in mental health. Could the Secretary of State set out in further detail how CCGs will be held to account for ensuring that that money gets to the front line so that we can deliver progress on parity of esteem?
Yes, I can absolutely do that, and I think it's a very important point because we have had a patchy record in the NHS of making sure that money promised for mental health actually reaches the front line, and the way that we intend to address this is by independently compiled Ofsted-style ratings for every CCG in the country that actually highlights where mental health provision is inadequate. Those ratings are decided by an independent committee chaired by the same Paul Farmer who is responsible for the independent task force report. So he's able to check up on progress towards his recommendations. And I'm confident by doing that we'll be able to shine a light on those areas that are not delivering on the promises that this government has made to the country.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After the recent inquiry the Health Select Committee did into suicide, I absolutely welcome the extra funding to mental health, and I'm sure the Secretary of State remembers some of the discussions that we had in that room. I also pay tribute to the staff, and obviously with my background I know exactly what it's like when A&E is swamped, when you don't have anywhere to put people. I don't think the staff across NHS England are afraid of us discussing this topic and weaponising it. They are in tears. They are exhausted. They are demoralised. They have never experienced a winter like this. And perhaps the Secretary of State could explain why his figures suggest 19 diverts and only 2 trusts in serious problems, whereas what we're hearing from the Nuffield Trust is 42 or 50 trusts who are diverting, which is a third. That means it is widespread. And also talking about, and I totally agree, people going to A&E who don't need to be there, but they are not the people who are 3 deep on trolleys waiting for a bed for 36 hours. Those are people who need a bed and are therefore ill. We've discussed STPs and NHS sustainability on several occasions, and the concern people have is that because they don't have the money to redesign, they are starting with A&E closures and bed cuts. I would hope that this incident will show that that simply isn't possible. It's not possible for the UK, and particularly NHS England, to lose any more beds. In Scotland, we face the same problem of increased demand and shortage of doctors, yet 93.5% of our patients were seen within 4 hours on Christmas week, and the President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine estimates that in areas of England it's between 50 and 60%. That difference is how it's organised. It's the fragmentation, it's the lack of integration. There are things that can be done. Use community pharmacies, use GPs, and try and bring the NHS back together.
I hope the Honourable Lady won't take offence, because she has vast experience in this field, if I say her questions must be judged to be rhetorical questions, because I didn't observe any question marks, which I'm sure we will in future. Secretary of State. I was handy at that. I advertised the point to the House. Yes, but that was then. And this is now. That was when I was a badly behaved backbencher like the Honourable Gentleman. Secretary of State.
Well, I will try to interpret the questions in what she says. If she's saying, are the problems in England similar to the problems in Scotland, I think we share problems across particularly the busy winter period, and she has observed that in Scotland they're also failing to meet the target in Scotland. But she is right to say that bed capacity is an absolutely critical issue, and I think that it is an issue which we have not always got right in England. I think there have been times when beds have been decommissioned and actually the alternative provision that was promised has not been made, and that has had big knock-on effects. I think when it comes to what happens in Scotland and England, I think that Scotland has gone further than England in terms of use of community pharmacy, and that is something to be commended on. But England has gone further in our plans for reforming and increasing investment into general practice, which is what the President of the Royal College of GPs was talking about over Christmas, and she says she's very keen for Scotland to match the package that we've done in England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my honourable friend, right honourable friend, for his statement, and of course all of us know the work that's done in our local areas and all those who are working for the NHS at such a difficult time. In relation to mental health, would you confirm that the Prime Minister's very welcome speech this morning also emphasised the importance of perinatal mental health, and that some of the extra resource that's going in will continue that great work, but also emphasised that the point of transparency and trying to make sure that we know what it is CCGs are doing assists members of Parliament in their work, not only when we call for extra resource, but also to make sure that we play our part in making sure that locally our area does the best it can in compared with other areas, rather than simply make a general point on resources, which is always the very easiest one to make.
Well, as my colleague in the Department of Health, he did a huge amount of good work on mental health. And first of all, on perinatal mental health, we know that 20% of mothers suffer some form of pre- or postnatal depression, and that has a huge impact on the child, costing, with lifetime costs of around £10,000 for every birth in the US, in the country, caused by lack of proper mental health provision. So this plan today means that we will be able to treat an extra 30,000 women, which we think is the number of women who need to be treated better. On transparency, he also makes a very important point, and I would put it like this. Funding matters, but when it comes to mental health, we have some of the best mental health provision in the world, but it isn't consistent. And the only way that we can get it consistent is by shining a light on the relative performance of different parts of the country, so that we can bring all areas up to the standards of the best.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Is the Minister aware that when he says there are 9 million more patient visits now as opposed to the year 2000, it makes no sense at all that in that climate, shutting hospitals like the Bulls of a community hospital, led by the Hardwick Commissioning Group, and the Secretary of State turns a blind eye to it. Will he look at this question? Because when you shut those hospitals, the beds are gone forever. Get stuck in.
I actually think that broadly he does make an important point, and that it isn't just about decisions to downgrade or close A&Es when there isn't alternative provision, but it's also about community hospitals, which are very important places for A&E and hospitals to step people down to. So I think he is right to say that the NHS, well, you know, I'm getting comments from a sedentary position here, but with the greatest respect, this is a process that has been going on in the NHS for decades, and I don't think we've always got it right under both parties. But I think he is right to say that we need to make sure that when there are changes in provision in community hospitals, we have good alternative plans.
Order. In wishing the Honourable Member for Morley and Outwood and the Honourable Member for Filton and Bradley Stoke all the best in the weeks and months ahead, I call Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to echo some of the points the Secretary of State has made. First of all, I'd like to echo some of the points the Secretary of State's made regarding the support for mental health with expectant mothers. As one myself, I have to say the midwife's been fantastic right from the very first appointments at grassroots level. It is something that they do mention, so we are feeling it on the ground. And I welcome the statement today as it shows the government's commitment to mental health by making it a centrepiece of the agenda. 1 in 50 young people in Yorkshire receive care for mental health. How will this new approach address the concerns of the young people and their parents, and what measures are in place to reduce the CAMHS waiting list?
Well, I'd like to add to Mr. Speaker's comments my very good wishes and my confidence that she will get superb care from the NHS, but also thank her for her campaigning on patient safety, where our principal campaign this year is on maternity safety. She will be pleased to hear. In bald numbers, the plan that we are outlining will mean that we are treating 1 million more people a year with mental health conditions by the end of this Parliament. Of course, many of those will be in Yorkshire. When it comes to young people, an additional 70,000 people will get treatment every single year, and that will, I hope, bring down the CAMHS waiting times. But we also want to do work in schools to stop people getting on the CAMHS waiting list in the first place.
Mr. Norman Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Young Minds survey before Christmas showed that in 50% of clinical commissioning group areas, there's a failure to spend the full amount of extra investment allocated to children and young people's mental health, which is scandalous, ultimately. I note his point about Ofsted-style ratings, but doesn't he need to introduce a system which guarantees that the money that the government promised for children's mental health is actually spent as intended?
Well, he is right to want to make sure that we live up to those promises, and one of the reasons is because he was a minister when some of them were made, and they are very important promises. But I would say to him that I think we are delivering what he wants. We are on track this year to spend around £1 billion more compared to 2 years ago when he was Minister for Mental Health. So I think that it has taken time for the NHS to get the message on mental health, but I think it is getting through loud and clear.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Say to my right honourable friend that as a frequent user of the Red Cross myself, an admirer of them, I regard their claims as being grossly over the top. And I join the Secretary of State in his tribute to the wonderful work that the frontline staff of the NHS are doing at a very difficult time. But would he agree with me that these pressures are not going to go away, and there must be a continuing drive for reform and to do these things better? And what will he tell the House? What exactly are the impediments in the NHS to the sharing of best practice? And secondly, what steps is he taking to create a more experienced and better trained leadership who are more prepared for the exceptional medical and management challenges the NHS now faces?
Well, my right honourable friend speaks extremely wisely, and I too think that we've got to be very careful about the language we use in these situations, because I think many vulnerable people can be frightened if you get the tone wrong, and the vast majority of NHS services are performing extremely well under a great deal of pressure. But his point on leadership is extremely important. It's one I've given a lot of thought to, and I think at the heart of it, the problem is that in this country we don't have enough hospitals being run by doctors and nurses. Around 56% of our managers have a clinical background. That compares to 76% in Canada, 96% in Sweden. And putting it bluntly, doctors like to be given instructions by other doctors. So if you're an exceptional person from a non-clinical background, you can do it, but it is hard because doctors have many years of training. They're highly experienced people. So I have put in place measures to try and make it easier for more clinicians to become our managers of the future.
In wishing the honourable member for Liverpool Wavertree all the best in the period ahead, I call Luciana Berger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In her speech today, the Prime Minister made a number of very hard-hitting observations. She said, there is no escaping the fact that people with mental health problems are still not treated the same as if they have a physical ailment. She reported on the increase in self-harm amongst young people, and she told us about the shocking reality that on average 13 people take their life every single day in England. Given the Conservative Party has been in government for almost 7 years, and the Secretary of State has been Health Secretary for almost 4 of those years, who does he think is responsible for the terrible failures highlighted by the Prime Minister today?
Secretary of State.
I just think that is a totally inappropriate question. She's kind of... It's with great respect to her, and she campaigns tirelessly on mental health, and she deserves great credit for that. That is the same as saying that the last Labour government should have sorted out every single problem in mental health by the year 2010, and I'm not standing here saying that, because the truth is that we have made good progress. If she thinks that it's trivial that we're treating 1,400 more people every day for mental health conditions, she should go and talk to some of her own constituents who are getting access to mental health provision, who would not have been getting that access under the poll of the last Labour government. We have made big strides in our mental health provision, but there is much more to do, and we're determined to do what it takes.
Sir Alan Hazelhurst.
Recognising that supply of extra resources for the NHS will be a vital and continuing issue, isn't my right honourable friend exactly right when he says that equal attention has to be given to controlling demand, so that people do not simply instinctively make calls on GP surgeries and A&E departments, which doctors themselves believe are avoidable and could be dealt with in other ways?
Well, I think my right honourable friend speaks extremely wisely. And at the heart of it, we have a good commitment, the 4-hour commitment, which was introduced by a Labour government, which I think personally is one of the best things the NHS does. The promise that if you're ill and you need urgent help, we will do something about it, get you under proper medical care within 4 hours. However, if you have a situation which NHS England now describe as up to 30% of the people in A&E departments don't actually need to be there, then you risk not being able to deliver that promise for the people who really do need it. And that is why looking at how we can control the demand from the people who don't need to be in A&Es, such as, for example, the significant increase in investment in general practice, but other measures as well, is going to be vital if we're going to crack this.
Ben Bradshaw.
He seems to be blaming the public for overwhelming A&E departments, when he well knows the reason the public go to A&E is because they can't get to see their GP, and social care is in crisis. Will he confirm that he has just announced another significant watering down of the 4-hour A&E target, following the watering down by the Coalition in their first year in office back in 2010? And what is he personally doing to address the chronic long-term underperformance of hospitals like that at Worcester, where 2 people died on trolleys, and Plymouth, one of the hospitals that had to call in the Red Cross over the Christmas period?
Let me just say to him, I think probably because of the forum that we're in now, he is misinterpreting what I've said, but it needs to be put right. Far from watering down the 4-hour target, I today recommitted the government to that 4-hour target. In just the answer before he spoke, maybe he wasn't listening, but I actually said that I thought it was one of the best things about the NHS that we have this 4-hour promise. But the public will go to the place where it is easier to get in front of a doctor quickly. And if we don't recognise that there is an issue with the fact that a number of people who don't need to go to A&Es are using those A&Es, if we don't recognise that problem and try and address it, then we won't make A&Es better for his constituents and mine. And I simply say, if he asks, what are we doing to turn around hospitals in difficulty? We've introduced the new CQC inspection regime, Chief Inspector of Hospitals, the most rigorous inspection regime in the world, which his party tried to vote down.
Mark Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement and the Secretary of State's confirmation about the extra support for mental health, and particularly welcome the review to be led by Lord Stevenson and Paul Farmer. As they carry out that review into improving businesses' ability to support people with mental health problems, can they particularly look at how we can help smaller businesses, those that perhaps don't have the human resource expertise that larger businesses may have, to make sure that people with mental health problems stay in work and are able to get back into work when they fall out of work? They're the biggest single category of disabled people not currently working, and we could make a huge difference.
Well, he will, of course, know that from his distinguished time as a minister in DWP, and he is right. And the central problem we're trying to address here is the fact that if someone, for example, stops turning to work and is signed off work because of severe depression, that is bad for the individual. It's also bad for the business. But too often what happens at the moment is it then sort of becomes entirely the NHS's responsibility to get that person back to work, and the business says, well, it's not our responsibility anymore because they're not turning up. Actually, with a little bit of help from the business, we could get that person back to work much more quickly. It would mean they would recover more quickly, the business wouldn't lose someone important, and that's what Dennis Stevenson and Paul Farmer are going to be looking into.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will never solve the challenges facing the NHS and social care until there is a long-term settlement for funding both. Does the Secretary of State understand that the social care precept is completely inadequate to filling the gap and will increase inequalities because the area that most need publicly funded care will be least able to raise that money? Will he speak to the Chancellor and the CLG Secretary to look again at this issue and get the funding social care desperately needed?
Secretary of State.
I do agree with her that there are serious funding pressures in social care, and we need a long-term solution to this, and we are doing important work on that. I think the precept is part of the solution. The local government settlement has been adjusted to take account of the different spending powers or revenue-raising powers of wealthier counties and wealthier local authority areas compared to other areas. We have to take into account the equality issue. She's absolutely right to do that. But if she's saying, have we solved the whole problem, the answer is no, there's more work to do.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the statement of my right honourable friend? Mr. Speaker, could I pay a huge tribute to everybody working at Nottingham University Hospital Trust, especially in A&E, and especially over the 9 days between Christmas and January the 2nd. Mr. Speaker, admissions almost doubled. At one point in the QMC A&E department, there were 180 people seeking treatment. That is a record. 395 more admissions than discharges in that 9-day period. So, real huge tribute to everybody who's working in our NHS. Could my right honourable friend give me an assurance that he will continue to work with our hospital trusts, like NUHT, as they bring forward plans to change schemes? It's not just simply about money, and do everything that he can to support them in these unprecedented times.
Well, I'm happy to do that, and I will echo her praise for the staff at NUHT, which I know was particularly pressured over Christmas. I also know they've made particular efforts to improve patient safety and the quality of care over recent years. But she is absolutely right, and of course I will continue to work closely with her trust. And
Robinson.
For Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at 9:30 this morning I received an email from a constituent in Coventry who asked me to bring it to the Secretary of State's attention. I'm delighted to do so. She writes as follows, very short, Mr. Speaker. I'm a nurse with 26 years' experience who's always worked full-time, has paid my tax and national insurance without ever having to burden the government, social services or the NHS itself, but have gladly served and given 100% to it. Unfortunately, she continues, my 18-year-old daughter has recently become unwell mentally and attempted suicide twice in a 3-week period. I'm really sad to say, this comes from a nurse with 23 years' experience, the care she's been given has been dreadful. I'm somebody who works in the NHS, so I understand the strains the service is under, but I also expect as a family who gave so much to society and still do, when it is our time of need, we can expect a service that meets our needs. I brought that to his attention, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask him, would he kindly agree to me to arrange for Mrs. Hardy and myself to meet, Sarah Hardy is the lady's name, with somebody who can give her some sort of reassurance. She continues that she's been waiting 6 months without any mental health assessment or support from the NHS. 6 months for a daughter of 18 years of age. Will you agree to do that so it's just not more hollow words?
State.
Well, I'm more than happy to meet her, but what I'd like to do ahead of that is to try and look at the particular issue as to why she's having to wait so long. I think he puts it very eloquently, and she puts it very eloquently. I mean, we owe a huge debt to people like that, and what she is describing in terms of her own 19-year-old daughter's treatment is just not satisfactory. It's not good enough, and that's why this morning the Prime Minister talked about the injustice of having to wait so long for treatment, and that is exactly what we are trying to put right.
Dr. James Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House of Commons Library calculated that the real terms increase in health-related spending between 2010 and 2016 in England was 9.4%, yet it was 0 in Wales. Not only are A&E waiting times consistently longer in Wales than in England, but waiting times for routine procedures can be as many as 2.5 times longer in Wales. And I regularly see constituents in tears waiting well in excess of a year for hip operations. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that the party opposite must start acknowledging the challenges facing the NHS in Wales and also responsibility for them?
Secretary of State.
I think his constituents in Wales would be appalled by the reaction we've just had then. They stand on their high horse complaining about NHS care in England, but when he brings up poor NHS care in Wales, they tut and they make noises as if they don't want to hear it. If they care about NHS patients, they should care about them throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. And I'm afraid that just shows the party political agenda. Yes, he's right. NHS care in Wales is worse, and they need to do something about it.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been contacted by several constituents who spent 14 hours in A&E waiting for a bed. We've also been hampered, as well as by social care cuts, by a shortage of A&E doctors, something that the Health Department was warned would become a growing problem over 5 years ago, and that the Health Select Committee warned about again last year. So when will this shortage of A&E doctors be ended by the government? By the summer? By next year? By the following year? He has had 7 years. When will he deal with the shortage of A&E doctors?
Stay. Well, let me tell him what we've done on A&E doctors. So the number of A&E doctors... Let me tell her... I'm sorry, apologies. Let me tell the Right Honourable Lady what we've done about A&E doctors. They've gone up since 2010 by 1,200. That is over 50% increase. The number of A&E consultants has gone up by 500. That is over 20% increase. At the same time, we've recruited 2,000 more paramedics. And as a result of those changes, our emergency departments are seeing within the 4-hour target 2,500 more people every single day compared to 2010. Now, that is not to minimise the pressures in the NHS that we've had over winter, and that is not to say there isn't more that needs to be done, which is why I outlined a number of things in my statement.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Secretary of State kindly came to see the plans for the emergency room at Worthing Hospital and came back 6 years later to see how it's working in operation. He'll admire that, and I hope next time he comes he can look at the Zachary Merton Community Hospital and the Swansea Mental Health Services as well. Can I put to him on the child mental health care that we have 700,000 teenagers going through each year, each stage, and a quarter of them will have bumps and need resilience. Their parents and their teachers need help. Can he try to make sure that the Green Paper covers advice to parents and to teachers so they know what's in the normal range of behaviours and what goes outside them?
Can I first of all commend the Right Honourable Gentleman for his one-man campaign against the misinformation put out by 38 Degrees, which I continue to admire on many occasions, and also thank the staff at Worthing Hospital for their fantastic work over the busy Christmas period. He actually, as usually, puts his finger on a very important issue, which is that as we seek to raise the profile of mental health treatment for children and young people, what we mustn't do is medicalise every single moment of stress, worries before exams. Those are not a cause to talk to an NHS psychiatrist. And so I think a lot of our work in the Green Paper is going to be looking at how we can promote self-help, how we can help schools to support people through difficult patches, but then when NHS care is needed, how we can make sure people get it quickly.
Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's great to see the Secretary of State here today in the Chamber after he's enjoyed his Christmas recess. While he was away, staff on the NHS frontline had to work double shifts. The London Ambulance Service computer system crashed, and we also found that the Red Cross needed to be drafted into our hospitals. Can the Secretary of State tell us today here in this chamber which hospitals he personally visited during the Christmas recess?
Well, let me just say to her that I was in touch with what was happening in the NHS every single day throughout the Christmas recess. But as someone who's worked in a hospital herself, she might perhaps think about whether it's particularly helpful for NHS hospitals to have visits by high-profile politicians right at their busiest period. But I have been very closely in touch. Now, she talked about the problems at London Ambulance Service, which was a problem which staff have been trained to deal with. And I just say to her that her own hospital, I think the staff worked extremely well, but what they don't welcome is the attempts that I think she's making this afternoon to try and politicise the problems that the NHS faces.
To Andrew Murison.
In connection with the changes to the 4-hour standard that the Secretary of State has heralded, what does he think can be done to incentivise and upskill GPs who may wish to take a closer interest in minor and moderate illnesses, including the use of nurse-led minor injury units?
Well, I think these have a very important role, and I think if we look at some of the most successful and best-performing trusts in the country, like Luton and Dunstable, for example, what they do is they have a very good streaming process at the A&E front door with good alternatives for people who are not appropriate to go into an A&E department, and that's what we need to learn from. So I think nurse-led units can be very important. I think GP-led units can make a big difference as well. It won't be the same everywhere for reasons of space, if nothing else, but there is a solution that everywhere can adopt.
Caroline Flint.
We have seen in the last few weeks pressures in the NHS, which I think to a certain extent the Secretary has acknowledged. But what is surprising to me is that given that we are not in the midst of a very desperate cold spell yet, given that we are not in the midst or throes of a flu epidemic, how can the Secretary of State come here today and I think rather complacently suggest that he has a grip on the services in our NHS? And I'd like to know why he wasn't on top of those trusts which he knew were weak, who knew were potentially under threat if any pressure occurred, and what is he going to do when we hit the cold snap and people are suffering from flu in large numbers?
Well, I'm afraid I reject that suggestion, and if you want to know what we've been doing over the course of the year, as I said in the statement, we have 1,600 more doctors than we had just a year ago, over 3,000 more nurses. We have the biggest flu vaccination programme in our history. We had 12,000 additional GP sessions booked for over the festive period. So there was a huge amount of work that was done, and a particular focus on distressed areas, and many of those distressed areas actually did cope extremely well. Not all of them, which is why there's more work to do.
David Tredinnick.
The Health Committee in the last Parliament looked at children and adolescent mental health services. One of the main concerns was the distances travelled by patients, sometimes halfway across the country to get treatment. And can he expand on his plans to reduce attendance at A&E? Does he envisage a new form of gatekeeper, and is he intending to try and keep drunks out of A&E?
Rather than the phrase gatekeeper, I probably use the word streaming and making sure that we have good alternative offers for people who don't need to be in A&Es, because frankly it's not safe for an A&E department to have people there for 6, 7, 8 hours with a minor injury who haven't got an urgent health need. It's distracting for staff and can make it more difficult for them to deal with people who have more immediate needs. But in terms of the distances travelled, it is, as the Prime Minister said this morning, completely unacceptable for people to have to go 400 miles for a mental health bed. So what's the solution? Well, we are commissioning more beds, but actually the solution is to intervene earlier so that people don't get to that stage in treatment where they need inpatient care. We know that if we intervene earlier, in many cases, we can head off that need and help people get better more quickly.
Chris Leslie.
This afternoon, the patients at Nottingham's QMC emergency department are waiting on average for more than 4 hours. In the last month, for figures are available, that's 3,500 people who had to wait for more than 4 hours in the emergency department. We can't go on like this. So will he agree to fast-track the capital that we need to increase the capacity at Nottingham's emergency department?
I'll happily take a look at that. And obviously, when it comes to the allocation of capital, we do prioritise any projects that will help us improve the situation in any departments and reduce the stresses.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Secretary of State has acknowledged that there is a shortage of acute mental health beds, and this arises from a decision by many health trusts to close beds in favour of putting resources into services in the community. One effect of this is that people approaching a mental health crisis find it harder to know where to turn for help. So will he explain more about the crisis provision in which we are now investing this extra £15 million, and in particular, is there a common way of knowing how one can easily access these vital services?
I'm happy to supply more details. The £50 million is for places of safety that is very specifically focused on support for the police service, so that we can make sure that we live up to what will be our legal commitment from this year, not to send young people into police cells when actually what they need is mental health support. But more broadly, he's right that there's a policy change, which I think most people think is the right thing, which is to treat more people in the community where we possibly can. What I think is not working in the way it needs to is the tier system, which divides people up into 4 tiers and means that sometimes we say to people, well, we can't treat you because we're tier 3 and you're not sick enough to be on tier 3, and so people get sent away, and that is not acceptable, and that's why we're doing this green paper, and we want to look at a better way forward.
Margaret Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State accept that it's not solely down just to an ageing society in the crisis and the deepening crisis in the NHS, and that failure to provide sufficient funding is the key to this crisis and therefore is possible to address, and what will he do about it?
But if she is worried about funding, she might perhaps explain why funding for the NHS in England went up by double the rate of funding for the NHS in Scotland over the last Parliament. But she is right. And I will get her the figures on Northern Ireland, but I just say that by way of reference. But let me agree with her that, as well as apologising for my earlier error, let me agree with her that it isn't just about the ageing society. It's also about changing consumer expectations. It's about the fact that people want access to healthcare 24/7 today in a way that wasn't the case 10 or 20 years ago, and that itself is a cause of a lot of the additional pressure.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's announcements on mental health, and it is absolutely clear that the government is serious about improving mental health treatment and prevention. The challenge, though, is to translate ambitions into action. Can my right honourable friend assure me he will put in place mechanisms to make sure these proposals and those in the 5-year forward view for mental health become reality? And specifically, would you look at one step, which is to make sure that no STP is signed off without clear plans and funding for improving mental health care?
Well, I can assure her that that is happening, and indeed that one of the key metrics by which we will be judging STPs is their progress on delivering our mental health targets. She's absolutely right to say that the ambitions need to turn into action. But I think that because of the comments that she and many other honourable members have made over the last few years, she will find that actually there is much more understanding in the NHS that this is a big priority, and understanding of the fact that we need to stop resources constantly being sucked into the acute sector, as has happened over many years.
Michael Duggar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State recently announced the government were pressing ahead with significant cuts to community pharmacy budget in the Department of Health in face of huge opposition from members of both sides of the House, members of public and healthcare professionals. Given evidence that 1 in 5 people who would usually see a pharmacist for medical advice say they will make a GP appointment if their local pharmacist is closed, in areas of higher deprivation like my own it is 4 in 5, and with the risk that many of these people in desperation will turn up at the local hospital, isn't the government in danger of making an appalling crisis in the NHS even worse?
Well, we are having to ask the pharmacy sector to make efficiency savings, just as we're having to make all parts of the NHS make efficiency savings. 40% of pharmacies are clustered in groups of 3 or more. And it doesn't make sense for the NHS to continue to subsidise pharmacies that are very close to other pharmacies. So our reforms are designed to ensure that where there is only one local pharmacy people can access, that pharmacy is protected.
Seema Kennedy.
Does my right honourable friend acknowledge the damaging effect that loneliness can have on mental health, and will he join with me in welcoming the launch of the Joe Cox Loneliness Commission at the end of this month?
I'm happy to do that, and I'm also happy to acknowledge the importance of this issue. And when it comes to older people, the latest figures I've seen are that 5 million older people say that their main form of company is the TV. And that is not acceptable, and we, all of us, have a responsibility to do better in that respect. And of course, not just from a moral point of view, but from a practical point of view, this leads to people more likely to need hospital treatment, which is of course expensive and challenging for the NHS.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has talked a great deal about preventing people getting to A&E by intervening much earlier, and yet
surely he has to recognise that the cuts that have been made to local authorities, the cuts in social care, make it much more likely that people will not be picked up earlier in the progress of any particular illness and will go and have to resort to the health service in a much more difficult situation. Can't he now have a discussion with his colleagues on the front bench and tell them, particularly the Chancellor, that they have got this wrong and we have to invest in preventative services, which means refunding local authorities, not the 57% cuts that my authority has had. It means investing now in proper social care, not the £5 billion of cuts that we've seen in social care since 2020. Otherwise, the pressure on our NHS will just continue.
I actually agree with her broad point about the importance of the social care system and its interconnectedness with the NHS. And we faced in 2010, as she well knows, because her party's manifesto reflected this as well. We faced a very challenging economic situation in which both parties recognised the needs for cuts to be made in public spending. But what changed in 2015, at least in this party's manifesto, was the recognition that actually when it came to social care, we needed to make sure we were increasing funding into the social care system. And after the changes announced by the Community Secretary in December, all local authorities are able to increase funding for social care in real terms, and I hope we can start turning things around.
Neil Carmichael. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the recent Education Select Committee report on children and care in mind, I certainly welcome the Prime Minister's refocus on mental health and the Secretary of State's continued support of action to be taken. But what steps does he have in mind to actually deliver actual practical steps, given that we found that local integration, effective relationships and indeed the teaching of PSHE all help to produce good outcomes?
Well, I think he's absolutely right, and obviously his role in the Select Committee will give him a particular insight into this. But we don't want to rush to come to a solution on this, which is why we said we will do a green paper before the end of the year, because it is complex, and indeed other honourable members have alluded to the risks of medicalising problems when we know that all young people at school have periods of stress and anxiety and worry that are not necessarily diagnosable mental health conditions, and we wouldn't want to make them as such. So this is about thinking through a smart way to improve resilience training, self-help, but also to educate schools so that they are able to spot when this is just a temporary period in the run-up to exams or whatever, or when this could be something a lot more serious like OCD or an eating disorder or something that needs more immediate help. And that is something where today we've started a big education programme with schools, but we want to go further.
Yes, Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to welcome the extra investment, if it in fact turns out to be extra investment in mental health. I wanted to push the Secretary of State on the question that was asked, in fact, by my honourable friend from the dispatch box earlier around educational psychology and how that is going to work in. I speak as a mother of a child with SEN issues who has relied on clinical and educational psychology in schools, and the school where my children currently go to is increasing the class sizes from 30 to 33 and reducing the teaching staff, specifically those who engage with SEN children, because of changes to educational funding. I wonder if the Secretary of State can tell me how he thinks that will affect the children's mental health in my children's school.
I think what she raises is a very important issue, and I know that I've had constituents, and I'm sure she has too, where they found access to educational psychologists difficult, where they've not been able to get the plan approved that they need to. And this is what we will be considering in the build-up to the Green Paper, and I would encourage her to participate in that process.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Health Secretary please get the message out there loud and clear to health bosses up and down the country that we need more capacity in our A&Es, so that when my CCG come forward to NHS England with a request for £285 million for their appalling plan to downgrade my local A&E, bulldoze Huddersfield Royal Infirmary, replace it with a small planned care unit with fewer beds, that money would be better spent on frontline frontline A&E care in one of the country's biggest towns.
Voted for it.
Well, I of course take seriously everything he says, and I will say this to him, that the NHS doesn't always get these things right. I led a campaign against an A&E closure in my own constituency when I was a backbencher. And the party opposite was in power, and they were about to take a wholly mistaken decision, which luckily I was able to persuade them not to take in the interests of my constituents. So we will look carefully, and I do think that the broader point he makes is one that we have to understand across the NHS, that capacity matters. What I would say is that in the long run, we are not going to solve this problem simply by forever increasing capacity in A&Es, because actually we need alternative forms of provision. It just isn't possible if you look at the way demand is growing. So we need to find different ways of offering treatment to people who don't actually need to be in an A&E, and that's what we're exploring.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do declare an interest, as my husband is an A&E consultant. If the Secretary of State would speak to him, he would tell him that the extra pressure on A&E, as we've already heard, are because of the disappearance almost of preventative care, of social care and of other services. And it's not individuals arriving at A&E who shouldn't, it's other services referring those people to A&E when we shouldn't. So would the Secretary of State now take responsibility for his government's decisions over the last 6 years that have now turned out to be false economies of cutting all these vital services back to the bone, that is now putting A&E on the brink of breakdown?
Well, with respect, I agree with the broader principle that preventative care is absolutely vital. I disagree with the suggestion that this has been cut to the bone. We had 1,600 more GPs. That's an increase of 5% in the last Parliament. The NHS budget was protected. We recognise that there are problems in the social care system, which we are now in the process of putting right. But both at the last election and the last election, which she indeed had quite a lot of input into Labour's policies, and the one before, the party promising the most resources for the NHS was on this side and not on her side.
True, it is.
Sir Edward Lee.
Everyone knows that the Secretary of State has an impossible job, which he does with humanity and energy. But one of the parts of his impossible job is the two-tier system that we have, depending on where you live. In rural North Lincolnshire, you can wait over 3 weeks to see a doctor. You can even wait 2 hours for an ambulance to come. This is on top of lack of investment. 2 hours people have waited, lying in the street in places like Market Raisin, waiting for an ambulance. This is not acceptable, even more on occasions. This is on top of long-term lack of investment, as in the lack of a psychiatric unit at Bede Hodgkins Centre in Lincoln. I just wonder whether we don't need to start an honest discussion with the people about how we're going to devote more resources to health in this country, perhaps through social insurance models, or even, God forbid, and I know people won't agree with this, charging people who don't turn up for appointments.
Well, whilst I don't agree with moving to a social insurance model, the broader issue that he talks about in terms of resourcing the healthcare systems is one which I do actually have some sympathy with. I think we have to recognise, if we're going to have, 1 million more over 65s in the next 5 years, over the decades ahead, we are going to have to find a way of continuing to invest more in our health and social care systems. And this year, we're doing that with an extra 3.8 billion. And over the decades ahead, governments will continue to need to do that. I think there is a specific problem that he highlights rightly. I don't have a solution to it now, but I do want him to know that I understand the problem, which is that in rural areas, people can wait too long for ambulances. And the system of targets that we have does incentivise ambulance services to prioritise the calls that they can do quickly in towns nearby. And that is something that I will look at.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The State of the Secretary of State, he tells us he has a plan and he has a strategy to deal with this, so I assume he must be on top of all these facts. So to assure us he understands the scale of the problem, can I ask him, as of the latest count this week, how many beds were being blocked in hospitals by people who could be discharged, but there wasn't the facilities in the community to provide care for them?
I will write him with those figures.
Sir Andrew Salou.
more than a third of A&E attendances at peak times are caused by drunkenness, and behaviour on this scale is as unacceptable as it is irresponsible. So what more can we do to hugely reduce that proportion by this time next year?
State.
Well, I think the issue he raises is one about public responsibility. These are our national health services, and we need to treat them in a responsible way. And it is frankly selfish to behave in an irresponsible way and then create pressure on an A&E, which means that someone else who needs that help may not be able to get it.
Private nurse.
Is the Secretary of State accusing the Red Cross of weaponising the National Health Service? And secondly, can I say to the Secretary of State, when the NHS is making cuts, the services that suffer time and time again are the so-called Cinderella services, i.e. mental health services. And the only way you can prevent that is to ring-fence that funding, to force local commissioners to demonstrate to local populations that that extra money is genuinely going on improving mental health services. And finally, as my honourable friend said, the other thing that happens that when you cut local authority services to the bone is they end up only being able to provide statutory services, and all the preventative services go. Never mind the cuts to social care. So what is stopping the Secretary of State commissioning an all-parties group to look at a sustainable long-term funding model for social care?
Secretary of State.
The Prime Minister has said that we need to find a long-term solution to the funding of social care, and that is work that is ongoing, and we recognise the urgency of the situation. But I would simply say to him, the evidence about whether or not services for mental health are reaching the front line is whether actually more money is being spent on mental health provision than in previous years. And as I said earlier, it's around £1 billion more being spent than 2 years ago.
Karen Lumley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend has mentioned, the A&Es at Worcester and the Alexandra Hospital in Redditch have been under huge pressure over the last few weeks. Can you reassure patients at both of our hospitals that all is being done to help alleviate the situation now? But also, whilst I'm grateful for measures that are being put in place, what we really need at our trust is a capital bid of £29 million to be agreed to increase capacity to alleviate this problem, and I'd urge my right honourable friend to look at this as a matter of urgency now.
Well, I totally recognise that, and I want to thank her for her interest on behalf of her own constituents in what's been happening. And there are a number of things happening. Subject to staffing, there'll be a new ward opened at the Trust next week. We have a new Chief Executive arriving at the Trust in the spring, and we recognise the need for capital spending to increase capacity at both the Alex and the Royal, and we'll look sympathetically at that bid.
Mr. Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State couldn't resist his customary political attack on the Welsh NHS today. Well, I had cause to visit my local hospital to go to A&E this weekend with a family member, and had a brilliant, speedy and expert service. So can I invite him to join me in congratulating the staff at Royal Glamorgan Hospital? Can I further invite him to congratulate the Welsh Labour Government on not having to call in the Red Cross to any hospital in Wales? And can I also invite him to congratulate them on their long-standing emphasis on mental health, meaning we spend more on mental health provision per capita in Wales than in England or indeed any part of the UK, notwithstanding the £2 billion cut he's made to the Welsh budget in the last 6 years.
Well, in his long list of statistics, what he wasn't prepared to say is that people wait twice as long for a hip replacement in Wales, more than double the proportion of the population are on a waiting list for NHS care. That's 1 in 7 people in Wales compared to 1 in 15 in England. And you're 40 times more likely to be waiting for a diagnostic test result, waiting too long for a test result in Wales compared to in England.
No answer.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that Torbay, like any other hospitals, has been under pressure due to the demographics of an ageing population in the Bay. But would he agree with me that it's encouraging to hear of work being done at places like Chelston Practice, which I visited on Friday, to make sure doctors can be available on the day to those who need them, but also that people are actually sent away to specialists who can help them better, like a physiotherapist, rather than just taking up vital GP appointments?
Yes, indeed, and I congratulate all the NHS and social care staff in Torbay who are doing a fantastic job, and also on the pioneering work they've done on health and social care integration, which I know has made a huge difference to his constituents.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the new year, East Midlands Ambulance Service saw life-threatening calls up 42% on last year, and the chair of Nottingham University Hospitals Trust described their emergency department as pushed to the limit, where, as the Honourable Member for Broxtowe has already said, almost double the normal number of hospital admissions. So clearly these were necessary attendances, but surely many of them could have been prevented. He's already acknowledged the connection between inadequate social care and this entirely foreseeable crisis. So I ask again, will he commit his government to properly fund it?
I just find these questions about funding curious, coming from a party that, had we followed their plans, will be spending £1.3 billion less on the NHS this year compared to what the NHS is actually getting. And I just say to them, the reason that we're able to spend that extra money on the NHS is because we know how to run the economy.
Mr. Ben Howlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's all too often been the case that mental health patients have wondered if this issue actually has enough leadership, and I'm incredibly pleased to see that the Prime Minister made one of her earlier speeches on this particular issue. But while no one in this House would oppose an extra £1.4 billion being invested over the course of this Parliament, may I just echo the words of the Chief Executive of Mind, in that the proof will be in the impact this investment has on patients' day-to-day experiences. So will the Secretary of State ask the Minister to meet with me to discuss the plans to build a new psychiatric and dementia care unit at Bath in order to service the whole of the South West?
I am happy on his behalf to ask the Minister to meet him to discuss that psychiatric unit. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But this is the first time that I can remember that a Prime Minister has made her first major speech on the NHS about mental health, and indeed talked about the importance of sorting out mental health on the steps of Downing Street as she arrived. So I think that is a sign of the commitment coming right from the top.
Karen Buck.
Speaker, the fabulous team at Imperial St Mary's in West London are featuring in a television programme this week, and the Chief of Service for Emergency Care is reported as saying, "We have just had our worst 10 days on record. There's nowhere in the hospital to move anybody. What's happened in the last 2 years, the whole system countrywide has ground to a halt." Now, part of that is because there is more than the equivalent of a ward of patients at any time who cannot move out of the hospital because there is nowhere for them to go. Does the Secretary of State accept that his government has gone too far in the destruction of local government finance, including social care? And does he accept that despite all the rhetoric, next year local government finance will go down, not up?
Secretary of State.
First of all, I would like to thank the staff at Imperial, who alongside other NHS staff have done a fantastic job over a very difficult period. What I say to her is that 50% of councils have got no delayed discharges of care. So whilst this is a problem in many hospitals, there are many areas that are actually managing to deal with this problem, and that's why I would suggest that the local authorities that serve her constituencies should look at other parts of the country that are dealing with this problem.
John Howe.
I welcome the provision of mental health facilities, services for schools, but will he ensure that the type of first aid that he's proposing for this is available to MPs and their staff, given the number of people with mental health problems that we deal with during surgeries?
Yes. It's an absolutely excellent suggestion, and I'm very happy to take it up.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the problems we've been hearing at A&E throughout the afternoon are symptomatic of problems elsewhere in the system, aren't they? If you take Aintree Hospital, where the staff are doing a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances, 130 patients, as of today, are medically fit for discharge. Social services are simply unable to support them to go home or to go into care elsewhere. And if you take, he needs to accept the cut to £4.6 billion to social services was a mistake. And he needs to accept that the Better Care Fund is simply not delivering. It is money being recycled from elsewhere in the system. And if you look at the figures in Sefton were promised 9 million. They've had less than 1 million. So if he's serious about sorting out the problems in social care over the long term, he needs to get the funding right. He needs to reinvest all of those cuts that have been made.
Well, I do accept that there needs to be more funding going to social care, and that's why we're putting an extra £3.5 billion into social care per annum by the end of the Parliament. But what I would say to him is that even despite the very real pressures in social care, there are many local authority areas, there are many hospitals that have no delayed discharges of care at all. In fact, half of all the delayed discharges are in just 20 local authorities. So as we wait for that funding to come on stream, and it's not all coming on stream at the start of the Parliament, there is lots that can be done.
Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for paying tribute to frontline staff? I declare an interest as someone who worked in the NHS over the Christmas period and saw firsthand some of the pressures that frontline staff are facing. But these are winter pressures that are faced every year, certainly in my 20 years' experience of working as a nurse. On the subject of mental health, would the Secretary of State also pay tribute to mental health care nurses in Sussex and Sussex Police, who by their joint working have reduced the amount of patients who've been placed in a prison cell as a place of safety by 50%? And in a county that has Burling Gap and Beachy Head, that is a huge achievement.
Secretary of State.
Well, first of all, I welcome her contribution to this House as a practising nurse, and I think that adds greatly to this House. I'm more than happy to pay tribute to our brilliant mental health nurses, who I think have one of the most stressful jobs that you can have, and particularly the ones in Sussex with those particular tragic suicide hotspots.
Catherine West.
With the cold weather coming, could I return to the point of the flu epidemic risk and say that a desperate doctor wrote to me last night to say sooner or later there will be an epidemic, and let me tell you, we cannot cope. Another shift, another full hospital, another gridlocked A&E, more desperate but often implausibly understanding patients, another 13 or 14-hour shift with one 10-minute break. Some patients and relatives get angry, some despair. Most watch us and realise we can't physically do anything more. Please help me as the MP to represent her, and please help us to have more staff.
Well, I think that doctor speaks for many doctors who are working incredibly hard, particularly in our emergency departments, and I would say to that doctor that we recognise the need for more doctors. We are recruiting more doctors, not just across the NHS but in emergency departments in particular, but we also recognise that we need to find a different way of dealing with some of the patients who come to the hospital front door so that we can alleviate that pressure, and that's what we're looking at.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've recently visited Bridewell Organic Gardens in my constituency, which is an award-winning charity which improves the mental well-being of those suffering from a range of mental health conditions. I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement this morning raising awareness of that ongoing stigma with regards to mental health, as well, of course, as the £1 billion investment and the commitment to improving services. But would the Minister be prepared to investigate such schemes as the one I have mentioned to ensure that treatment of those suffering from mental health conditions is not simply limited to the provision of medication?
I'm absolutely prepared to do that, and I think that we do need to be very open-minded about the fact that mental health in some ways is a relatively new field. Research as to what works best is continuing to uncover many new things, and much of that research is actually happening in this country. But I think there has been a big move away from thinking that medication is always the best way forward. We've seen a huge expansion in talking therapies in the last few years in this country, and I'm sure that trend will continue.
Paula Sheriff.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the best efforts of dedicated NHS staff, patients attending one of my local A&Es were told they would routinely have to wait 11 hours just to be seen. People were in hospital trolleys for up to 20 hours routinely. Mental health patients were sent to Colchester because that was the nearest inpatient bed available for a 17-year-old. And somebody I know waited 6 hours for a 999 ambulance despite calling 999 3 times. You can do better than this, Secretary of State. So, to that end, can I implore you, in fact, plead with you, to intervene and suspend the needless downgrade of Dewsbury and Huddersfield hospitals, the downgrades of which will cost lives.
Well, none of the examples of poor care that she talks about are remotely acceptable. And let me say to her that on my watch and under this government, we will see no return to the bad old days where people were routinely waiting far too long. Well, we are recognising the problems that we've just had, and we are absolutely determined to make sure that we sort them out. With respect to her local hospital reconfiguration, if it ends up on my desk, because it's referred there by the local health scrutiny committee, and I then refer it to the independent reconfiguration panel, I will then look at the matter very carefully.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like to welcome the Secretary of State's statement today and the Prime Minister's focus on mental health. In particular, the mention of a suicide prevention strategy and the £1 billion funding commitment to improving services. Mental health is something that often doesn't just affect the patient, but the families and those often closest and dearest to them who care for them. Does he agree that raising awareness and tackling the ongoing stigma of mental health is a vital part of our work on mental health?
Yes, and she's absolutely right to mention that. And I would say that this is an area that we can approach with some optimism as to the potential for change. If she looks at the progress we made just in the last 4 years on dementia, there isn't a day that goes past without something being in the newspapers about dementia, and the understanding of dementia has changed dramatically. And so I think we can change attitudes, and we absolutely need to do that, because the only way you can get help to people in a mental health crisis is if they talk about it openly, and so this is a vital thing to change.
Terry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely agree with the comments that have been made about the pressures on GP services, the pressures on preventative health and on social care. But I want to particularly ask about mental health services for students. In the first few weeks of term this year at Bristol University, there were 3 suspected suicides. And I know from speaking to Dr. Dominic Thompson, who runs the student health services there, that the number of students presenting with mental health issues has grown exponentially over recent years. What can the Secretary of State tell us to reassure us that students leaving home for the first time, going to university, are going to be in safe hands?
Secretary of State.
Well, I actually had a very interesting afternoon where I visited the suicide prevention unit at the Bristol Royal Infirmary and a very good discussion about what they do, and they do some really pioneering things there, and I learnt a great deal from it. We have a particular concern about the growth in mental ill health amongst women aged 18 to 24, which has shown a very significant growth. And so this is an area we are very concerned about. Today, the Prime Minister announced that we have updated the suicide prevention strategy to make sure that all parts of the country can learn from best practice, including places like Bristol.
Justin Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's announcement on mental health, with excellent work led by Paul Farmer of Mind. The key challenge often is to identify those who need help and support. So will the Secretary of State agree to meet with the Department of Work and Pensions to look at ways that we can help signpost those identified through the personal independence payments process, to signpost them to the additional support and help available?
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that actually those meetings are already happening? We have a health and work green paper, and one of the things we're particularly trying to do is to speed up access to mental health services for people who are on benefit, who we can help to be more independent if we address their mental health problem more quickly.
Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to pick up on a point that the Secretary of State mentioned about the right sort of patient arriving at A&E. Pat, who's a frail elderly constituent of mine she had pneumonia-like symptoms, didn't want to go to A&E, didn't want to put pressure on hard-working staff, so she rang NHS Direct. She was told there was 100 people in front of her for a doctor's visit. Now, of course, she thought she was going to die if she was left in her house, so she went to A&E, where she waited 20 hours for a bed. Now, this is obviously, as you know, unacceptable. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that there is urgent and immediate demand for out-of-hours doctors? And if so, what is the Secretary of State going to do about it?
Hear, hear. Well, she is right. For people like her constituent, we need to have better alternatives to A&E, and sometimes they don't exist. But one of the things we need to do is to make sure that people who call 111 who need to speak to a clinician can get to speak to a clinician quickly. One of the things that we have piloted very successfully in other parts of the country is better GP supervision of people in care homes who are sometimes the most vulnerable patients. All these things are things we're looking at, but in terms of the broad direction of travel, she is right. We need to find a better way forward for people like her constituent.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In sparsely populated rural Lincolnshire, then, vital reforms to health and social care risk being undermined by the performance of the East Midlands Ambulance Service. We have a Police and Crime Commissioner who says his officers are routinely effectively acting as ambulance drivers. I know the Secretary of State understands the problems that we face in rural Lincolnshire, but does he agree with me that as it is currently constituted, East Midlands Ambulance Service is not serving the rural parts of its area as well as its staff want to, and indeed as well as my constituents need it to?
Well, as we discussed earlier, when the Right Honourable Gentleman for Gainsborough spoke, I do think there are areas where the service that ambulance service provides to rural areas is not as good as it should be because of sometimes the perverse incentives around the way the targets work. I have been nervous about changing the targets because I think then that can sometimes be taken as a kind of a signal to relax when I'm absolutely determined that we should meet the current targets. But I did make a commitment to the Right Honourable Gentleman from Gainsborough that I'll look into this issue, and I will do so.
Louise Hay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year in Sheffield, just 67% of Category 1 red ambulance calls were answered within 8 minutes. Last week, I met a constituent whose husband died whilst he waited for an ambulance for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Can the Secretary of State continue to stand at that dispatch box and say that the underfunding of our NHS is completely unlinked with these irresponsible and completely unacceptable response times?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, of course, what happened in that situation is totally unacceptable. You know, I think that she makes a mistake to continually bring this back to funding. If you look at, it's also about the demand pressures and about the models of care. And in the case of the ambulance services, just to reassure her about the extra funding that has gone in, we have around 200 more ambulances, around 2,000 more paramedics, and the ambulance service is doing every day around 3,400 blue light calls more than it was doing 6 years ago. So there has been significant investment, but clearly more needs to happen.
Mims Davis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The number of mental health patients in police cells is rightly down by 80%. People have bravely come to my surgery in my constituency talking about the issues where they found themselves with their families struggling with provision for mental health between 18 and 24 years old. And I pay tribute to Solent Mind and Southern Health, who are doing their absolute level best to deal with this issue. And one issue very directly affecting this age group of people affected is the tier system, the not being sick enough and not being sure where they should be going. Can the Secretary of State please confirm that he will focus the recruitment of specialists in this area, because it's not funding in my CCG, it is finding the people to help the people in need.
She's right, I think, on both counts. So one of the things that we need to do is to actually look carefully at where the tier system is not working as part of our work for the Green Paper that the Prime Minister announced this morning, because it isn't acceptable for people to be told that they're not sick enough to get the care that they urgently need. But all of the things that we have announced and we intend to announce to improve mental health will fail if we don't get the recruitment and training of new staff right. So with our commitment that we are making today to invest more in mental health, needs to come some very important strategic workforce planning, which I hope will be a benefit to her constituents.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State referred to assistance on a temporary basis being given to distressed trusts. But isn't there actually a more fundamental ticking time bomb, which is the sustainability and transformation plans? And can I draw his attention to the debate that I had on the 16th of December about the North East London plan, which envisages a deficit of 578 million by 2021, and which says that on a normal business as usual case of normal type reductions and savings, there will still be a £240 million gap. That means poorer services. There is no capital provision for the closure of the King George Hospital A&E and its reprovisioning at Queen's Hospital. Can he look at this urgently, because there is going to be a massive crisis in my area unless urgent steps are taken to give more resources?
Well, I am happy to look at that issue. And can I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the staff of both Queen's and King George, who not only have done very well over winter, but also have made great progress in turning around that trust, which, as he knows, is in special measures. But I think we are hopeful might be able to come out of special measures under the new leadership at the trust at some stage during this year, but obviously that's a decision for the CQC.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kettering General Hospital, which serves my constituency, has a very significant problem with delayed discharge. And whatever the issue is about money, perhaps the problem with social care is the model. And would it not be a good idea, Secretary of State, if there was genuine commitment from the other side of the House to try and work together to find a social care system for the future?
Well, I think he is right to say that we need to have these discussions in a less politically charged way, because we need to find a solution that will survive changes in government and will be fit for the long term. But what I would also say to him is that I think we miss a trick when we say this is primarily about funding, because actually we have a huge variation in provision. There are many local authorities where there are no delayed discharges of care, as we discussed earlier. And what doesn't happen enough in both the NHS and the social care system is people learning from best practice in other parts of the country, and that's what we want to change.
Anna Turley.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has spoken a lot today about trying to avoid unnecessary admissions to A&E. Could he tell me then why admissions to A&E on Teesside as a result of chronic malnutrition have trebled under the Conservative government, and whether he thinks that's any reflection at all on their broader approach to public policy and to tackling poverty in this country?
Well, what I would say to her is that the way you deal with those kind of terrible problems is by having a strong economy that allows us to support people through difficult periods in their life. And what we have is one of the strongest economies. In fact, this year I think we'll be the strongest economy in the G7, which allows us to do things like invest in our health and social care system. And it's this party that can deliver that.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've spoken before about the staggering rise in the number of patients presenting at A&E at Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, and the hospital confirmed to me this morning that they continue to see over 300 people each day with very high levels of delayed transfers of care. And the impact of this was brought home to me by a constituent, Anne, who tells me that on Thursday last week the facilities were so overcrowded that an adjacent seminar room was pressed into use, where bloods were taken and where she was treated behind a makeshift curtain, reclining on a standard chair. Awful conditions to be treated in, awful conditions in which to work. And the Secretary of State may say it's not about funding. Well, it's not about funding. Will he come to Cambridgeshire, sit down with his Conservative colleagues on the County Council and tell them where they're going wrong?
Well, first of all, I went to Addenbrooke's in the autumn. and I saw firsthand how hard the staff are working there. That's another trust that's in special measures but's made huge progress in trying to turn things around. And I met a number of staff in the emergency department as well, and I pay tribute to them for their very hard work. I've never said that it's not about funding. What I say is that it isn't just about funding, and there is huge variation, and what we see is parts of the country where they avoid in their emergency departments precisely the kind of overcrowding that he talked about in Addenbrooke's. Hospitals that do this very successfully, like Luton and Dunstable, for example, and what we need is all hospitals adopting what the best hospitals do.
This is Madeleine Moon.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the publication of the new suicide prevention strategy? Can I also welcome the fact that you've included self-harm in it? And thank you also for the mention of the work of the all-party group on suicide and self-harm prevention, which I chair. But can I ask the Secretary of State to meet with Dr. Robert Colgate? Dr. Colgate has set out a triaging system for mental health, which means that people don't have to wait 6-9 months to see a consultant. With the support of frontline staff, they can get an immediate triage assessment and assistance to help their condition be held. Can I urgently ask him to meet with Dr. Colgate? His work is being peer-reviewed by Manchester University, and have a look at how this can also, it has been rolled out across England, see how this can help us tackle the problems that we have.
Well, I thank her for her work on the suicide prevention APPG. I'm more than happy to meet Dr. Colgate, and the purpose of the refreshed suicide prevention strategy is to try to make sure that we adopt best practice throughout the country. There are some areas of the country that are doing a very, very good job in suicide prevention, particularly in co-opting the public into understanding that they can make a difference in this too. But I'm very happy to explore with her what more can be done.